welcome to the August 2nd edition of Ukraine Without Hype. I'm Anthony Bardaway. I very highly suggest going back to listen to our last episode where we discussed American politics and the elections and the troubling ideological background of the Republican vice presidential candidate J.D. Vance. Though because we did that and because July was let's say very busy month news-wise, we did fall back on some topics that I wish we could have covered during July, but I had to push back a few times, and hopefully this episode will have a bit more breathing space for that, namely regarding a kind of study of Russian opinions done by the Russian opposition outlet Meduza, as well as historical destruction being done by the Russian occupying authorities in Crimea. But before we do any of that, literally right before I was about to record this podcast yesterday, a bunch of news came out about a massive, I hate to call it prisoner exchange, but there's not a great word for it otherwise, that took place between the United States and Russia. Many high-profile political prisoners in Russia were released in exchange for the United States and mostly Germany in the European Union, giving up a crop of Russian spies, assassins, hackers that Russia has been asking for a while. So yeah, this happened, like I said, right as I was about to record, and I could not have this episode without it. So this episode is happening a day later than I hoped it would, but so we are. So what was this prisoner exchange? Well, the Russians, like I've said, are holding a lot of political prisoners. Some of these political prisoners are Russians themselves. Others are foreigners of one type or another. This is all extremely illegal. These people were all held on trumped-up charges, usually of spying, with no evidence given that they were spies, and Russia just wanted to take hostages for an exchange such as this one. Others were high-ranking members of the Russian opposition. The Russian opposition has not had a very good time of things since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. Most famously, Alexei Navalny, maybe the most high-profile member of the Russian opposition, was poisoned. And when he went back to Russia, he was arrested, held in horrible conditions in Arctic gulags until he eventually died. That was a very big story that we covered when it happened. But there are others, of course, both high profile and some lower profile. And the third category is various Germans. The Germans were a big part of this exchange. So about a third or so of those released by the Russians were German citizens. Some of them simply German, others German-Russian dual citizens. We'll get into the specifics of who they were now. So perhaps the most famous of these to an American audience would have been Evan Gershkovich. He was a Wall Street Journal journalist who had been in Russia reporting for various stories, and though he was an old hand in the country, had gone there after the full-scale invasion to basically cover what was going on when a lot of media had disappeared from that scene. I'll save my criticisms for later on in the segment, though. The release of Evan has been if you exist within Eastern Europe reporting circles, this is something that you've heard a lot about. He was friends with many people from, the BBC, the whole setup. So he's a very well-known journalist and became a very specific cause for that group. The United States government has demanded his release again and again because, again, he was held without any proof of him doing anything wrong whatsoever, just as a hostage. Donald Trump even alluded to the idea that if he was elected president, the next day Evan would be released because Putin would like to deal with him more than Biden. Another American that was kidnapped by the Russian authorities was Paul Whelan, a United States Marine who was in Russia in 2018 and was arrested again on charges of being a spy, which, again, no proof given of that. Of the Russian oppositionists that were part of the exchange, the three most famous ones were Vladimir Kara-Murza, Ilya Yashin, and Oleg Orlov. Vladimir Kara-Murza is very famous as a Russian oppositionist. He was opposed to the Russian invasion of Crimea and was honestly one of the few Russian oppositionists, not none, but few, who was much more aggressively against the Russian invasion back in 2014, 2015, and has been hounded by the Russian authorities ever since then. He was poisoned multiple times. The Russians really like poisoning, although the poisonings tend not to have a very high success rate, so I think it's more about sending a message when that happens, and had been in prison since shortly after the full-scale Russian invasion because he was considered discrediting the Russian army. Discrediting the Russian army can mean anything in Russia, down to saying that they might not be doing so well in a particular battle even. Discrediting the Russian army just means criticizing the government in some form and how it operates within the war context. Ilya Yashin, again, he's may have a higher profile in Russia, but again, a very high profile Russian oppositionist. He did have some legislative success. He was municipal deputy a number of times, ran for the mayor of Moscow until 2021 when he was barred from electoral activity due to being a quote-unquote extremist because he was a supporter of Navalny. And much like Kara-Murza, in 2022, he was accused of spreading false information about the Russian armed forces, discrediting the military, and was arrested and has spent the time ever since in jail. Specifically, he was spreading the true information about the Russian massacres at Bucha and the atrocities committed by the Russian armed forces there, and that was considered false information. That was a jailable offense. Oleg Orlov is one of the leaders of the Memorial Center. He actually won the Nobel Peace Prize along with Alexandra Matvichuk, and though the act of giving out a Nobel Peace Prize in conjunction between a Ukrainian, a Russian, and a Belarusian was considered very kind of insulting in Ukraine at the time. The fact is he does deserve some kind of recognition. He has, on one hand, been a major force behind recognizing the crimes of the Stalinist regime, as well as the crimes of the modern Putin regime. The Memorial Center was also a major player in whistleblowing on Russian activities during the Chechen War, for example. Other Russian oppositionists that were released were Alsu Kermasheva, who is with the RFERL Tatar Bashkir Language Service, Andrei Pivorov with Open Russia, as well as Lilia Chanisheva, Senya Fedeyeva, and Vadim Ostanin, who are associates of the Alexei Navalny movement. Another who is not particularly attached to any movement in Russia was Alexandra Skochelenko, and she is a young woman who was arrested for putting pieces of paper in the place of price tags in a supermarket containing information about the atrocities committed by the Russian armed forces. Again, doing that is illegal in Russia and has spent time in jail since then, even being accused of treason. And the last group to be released are the Germans. So among them is Rico Krieger. He's a German man who was in Belarus, where he was accused of sabotaging rail lines and was sentenced to death in Belarus for that. Kevin Leek is a German citizen who was sentenced for treason for photographing military equipment, allegedly. Dmitry Voronin, who was a German social scientist, was accused of spying. Herman Moises was a German who was helping Russians to immigrate to the EU to acquire permits for immigration and accused of spying, as well as Patrick Schobel, who is a bit different from the rest of the list, who were involved in some kind of journalistic or political activity. He was arrested for having cannabis gubbies in his bags when going through an airport. A bit different. Interesting to have him in there, but still the Germans wanted him back, and he was arrested for something very similar to Brittany Griner, who was arrested for having something related to cannabis. I didn't write this down in my notes, and was eventually exchanged for Russian spies years ago. Yeah, so that is who the Russians gave up for this deal. Some very high-profile people, a lot of high-demand people in there. And notably, none of them are actually criminals. They are opposition politicians who were jailed for purely political purposes. They were Americans who were held hostage in order to be exchanged at some point, and a bunch of Germans for the same reason. So who did the Russians get in response? Well, the Russians got a lot of killers, spies, including some very deep cover spies, hackers, and criminals. That is who they wanted back. Once again, showing the symmetry of who the Russians value and who other people value. And the first among these is Vadim Krasikov. Vadim Krasikov was a hitman for Russian intelligence services. The Russians never admitted that's what he was. They repeatedly denied it until he was eventually returned back to Russia. And now, yes, they are admitting that's who he was. Because here's the thing, Russians are not good at lying, but they'll do it anyway. If they just say a lie over and over and over again, they expect it to be treated as truth until they eventually get what they want. And then they're like, haha, I tricked you. When really they didn't trick anyone. So Vadim Krasikov in 2019 murdered a Chechen Georgian named Zemlechan Kangashvili in Berlin at the Kleiner Tiergarten. Kangashvili, like I said, was a Chechen Georgian. There's a population of ethnic Chechens that live in Georgia. He was one of them who had fought in the Second Chechen War against Russia, after which he went back to Georgia and became an asset of the Georgian intelligence services to hunt down Russian spies while also serving in the Russia-Georgia War in 2008. He moved to Germany until one of those Russian agents found him in Berlin and murdered him. Vadim Krasikov has been the main prisoner that Russia has wanted. They've tried to exchange him many times in the past and were told no. There was a possibility that he would have been exchanged for Alexei Navalny when Navalny was still alive. His name is brought up over and over and over again whenever there's an exchange, and every time thus far, the answer has been no because he is so dangerous until now. Most of the rest are less interesting, although Anna and Artem Dultsev have a bizarre story. They pretended to be Argentines living in Slovenia, and while doing so, raised a family and had children. If you've seen the TV show The Americans, about a group of Soviet spies who lived deep undercover in the United States and whose children did not even know they were Soviet spies, good TV show, watch it. That's the situation here. And their children were not aware that their parents were Russian spies, leading to a very awkward situation where when these two were returned to Russia after being arrested and held in Slovenia, the children were sent back to Russia with them. And the children, up until that point, did not know that they were Russian. They did not speak Russian. They spoke Spanish and presumably Slovenian, and now have to build a life as Russians now, when before that wasn't even an option in their brains. An interesting example was Pavel Rubtsov, perhaps a bit better known by his Spanish name Pablo Gonzalez. His parents were Spaniards who were extricated from Spain during the Spanish Civil War to Russia until his mother moved back and took him with him, so he has that dual identity. And for a number of years, he wrote quite a bit in Spanish language media that was straight up Russian propaganda. Wrote about how great and wonderful the Donetsk People's Republic was, how nasty and evil Ukraine was, how Russia was completely correct in all of its decisions and Ukraine completely wrong. For a long time, he was being treated as just, independent, dissident journalist telling the hard truths that the mainstream media is not willing to tell you, when the whole time he was just a Russian spy and all of his articles and writings were meant to service the needs of the Russian Federation. Now, I'm not saying that all pro-Russian writers are on the payroll of Russian intelligence services, but some of them are, and I kind of treat them all as the same in that regard anyway. They're all trash. So yes, Pavel Rubtsov, a.k.a. Pablo Gonzalez. Others included Vadim Konashenok, who was an FSB asset who was working to circumvent sanctions and acquire sanctioned American supplies for military production. Vladislav Glushin, a businessman who ran a hacking business, black hat hacking business. Roman Seleznev, a hacker, and Mikhail Mikushin, a spy pretending to be a Brazilian researcher in Norway. So that's the full list going either way, at least the information we have now. There may have been others, but that has been what is publicly available, the media news sources. But actually, the very first thing that stuck out to me and to many other observers of this was that most of the people that Russia was able to trade away, as it were just Russians. Like, this wasn't like a prisoner of war exchange or anything like that. America and Germany worked to get Russians freed. So that's not an exchange. That's America wanting political prisoners to be released, even though the political prisoners had nothing to do with them. However, one thing is important to me there, that this whole time, Russia has very much tried to paint their opposition, Kara-Murza, Navalny before, and others, as being antagonistic to Russia as a whole. And when a exchange is supposed to be ours for theirs, it kind of cements this idea of these prisoners that Russia exchanged away as being theirs, as being not Russian, as being on the other side of this, that we were able to have such an exchange happen. So I do not have much hope for the Russian opposition as a whole succeeding in many ways, but it will absolutely be used by the Russian government, and I've already seen it be used by Russian propagandists as a way of saying that Kara-Murza, Navalny, and all the rest are American agents, and this is how they are admitting that they are. So the first thing that really stands out is, of course, that a lot of these were Germans. The Russians really, really wanted to get Vadim Krasikov back, which meant the Germans had to get on board, which meant that a considerable number of the people that had to be released by the Russians had to be on Germany's list of people they wanted back. Fair. Next is that overall, this does seem like a lopsided trade in favor of the Americans and Germans. Russia gave up like some of the most important members of the Russian opposition, the liberal opposition, and could have gotten perhaps an even bigger price for Evan Gershkovich. That's, like I said, even became a campaign issue in the United States. He could have fetched a very high price. And in exchange, they got, a bunch of spies and assassins that there are other people doing that job. People present them as, being especially important, but Russia has other assassins running around. They don't especially need these ones. However, it does speak as a counter to that, which is my next point, to the mentality that Russia has during these exchanges, which is the mafia. Putin runs his circle like the mafia. These are his capos, and he had to be loyal to them as they are loyal to him, because that's how the mafia has to work. Russia has been willing to make seemingly lopsided trades in the past. So I think one of the big ones that comes to mind is that Russia gave up the leadership of the command of the defenders of Azovstal, including the Azov Regiment. And keep in mind that the leadership of the Azov Regiment was what Russians kind of presented as the reason why they were fighting the war. They were coming to Ukraine to denazify and get rid of the Azov Banderite bandits who had been abusing the Russian population of Ukraine or whatever. That is what the war was supposed to be about. Russia gave them up. They had them in jail. They could have killed all of them. They could have held them forever. They could have paraded them around as these are the Nazis we came to eliminate. And instead, what they did was exchange them for Medvedchuk. We've talked endlessly about Medvedchuk on this show. We've had episodes about him. So why do they want Medvedchuk back? He was Putin's guy in Ukraine. They were bound by basically mafia law to each other. And Medvedchuk, who had operated as the most important political player in Ukraine that was advancing Russian interests, Putin did have a sense of loyalty to him in that. He was part of the family. He was a made man, and you had to get back your made men. So Russia completely flouted everything that it said the war was about for the sake of Medvedchuk. And once you understand it through that mafia lens, it all makes a lot more sense. In this case, that's what I see happening here. Russia has to be loyal to its spies because, well, Putin himself is from the spy world. He relies on the Siliviki. Even as their independent power has decreased, he is still a man of the Siliviki. He is still a man of the mafia. So they weren't going to just leave these guys behind. Now, they clearly don't care about their own soldiers as much due to the difficulty in obtaining POW exchanges with Russia. And just them being sent to their deaths. There's something about the spy mafia in Russia that is closer to Putin's heart. It leads into the last thing I have to say about this is that this is a deal that happened between the United States and Germany and European partners with Russia directly. And from the viewpoint of Ukraine, that is a problem. Now, the phrase has always been nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. And I guess that is not fully applying here because it didn't have to do with Ukraine, but that's kind of the point. Seeing the West and Russia make deals on their own accord that have nothing to do with Ukraine or just bilateral between them, that's scary. Everything should be done through the frame of Ukraine and Ukrainians. They could have avoided this problem a little bit by getting back a Crimean Tatar political prisoner, by getting back Maxim Butkevich, the Ukrainian journalist who was captured near the beginning of the war. And It would have been very different. And then I don't know if the Russians would have accepted that, maybe if they would have, maybe the Russians were the ones who said that we are not going to be dealing with the Ukrainian question in this, but Ukraine should be treated as the central issue in anything regarding the West and Russia. And does this mean that there may be other back channel diplomacy happening between the United States and Russia that can lead to more problematic outcomes for Ukraine? We can't really know, because we know those channels exist that Ukraine wasn't a part of, and that's scary. That's scary. Maybe nothing will come of it. May this be a completely one-off issue. Maybe has nothing to do with Ukraine. Maybe the American officials behind it had to knowingly kind of grind their teeth in order to make this deal happen. Who knows? Information may be released elsewise, but we just don't have it yet. But really, really problematic, really worrisome, really something to pay attention to. And I'll close this all out by saying, don't go to Russia. Even if you're a journalist and think you can get the big scoop, don't go to Russia. Maybe you're a tourist that just wants to see how beautiful St. Petersburg is. Don't go. Because now that Russia has traded away their bargaining chips, they'll need more. And they clearly don't care who they actually get. They'll just accuse anyone of being a spy. And maybe you'll win that gamble. Maybe you'll go to Russia and they only need to kidnap 5 Americans. And you're probably not going to be one of those 5. I mean, there's a lot of people in the world. There's probably quite a lot of people going to Russia right now that will be on the roster. But just don't do it. Don't take that chance. I don't want some random American tourist who just gets caught up in things to be the reason why some high-profile Russian target has to be released. And especially with the case Kresikov, do some more killing even. Don't put yourself in that position. Please, just don't go to Russia. You don't need to go to Russia. It's fine. Just stay away from it. Honestly, especially if you're a journalist, because you will be targeted. But yes, moving on from that now, I'll talk about the battlefield updates. And since last week when I gave the battlefield update, the main thing that has changed has been at Pokrovsk. Most other fronts have not really changed. The breakthrough I mentioned near Kupiansk, they have not taken advantage of that further for the last week. New York, Toretsk region, the Russians have gotten closer to Toretsk city limits, but not much since how I described it last time. But Pokrovsk is scary. So the Russians, as they are advancing out of Avdiivka, they have been following the train line back to Pokrovsk, as we've discussed before, a major logistics hub that supplies a lot of the Donbass front of the war. And Ukrainian units there are taking loss after loss there. I use the word worrying, but it's worrying how it seems as though in every direction leading to Pokrovsk, there have been fallbacks for day after day, and not just in one section, but in all sections along that line, with the one exception of going directly northwards towards the highway that leads from Pokrovsk to the Donbass battlefields. But it has become a leadership problem, because once again, right now, as I'm looking at the battlefield map, there is yet another pocket that could very, very, very easily turn into an encirclement. And that encirclement, as we talked about in the last episode, the leadership, the military officer leadership in that section pulled out too slowly and had to have their hand forced by it. And we're seeing that exact same situation forming again. There is a massive problem with leadership in this section. And though obviously the Russians have a superior force of numbers and superior arms, the Ukrainian soldiers themselves in that section have mentioned the leadership problems. And I don't know why Syrskyi and the Ukrainian government are not acting faster on this. The Russians have figured out that there are specific units within the Ukrainian army that are more poorly led than others. They track them of where they are on the front. They track them of when they're having rotations so they can attack them during rotations. We have problems with some specific units, and not the soldiers themselves, but it's leadership. Get rid of this leadership. I rarely criticize the military so directly, but they are costing a lot of lives right now in the Pokrovsk direction. And I'm afraid that I'll be saying something very similar next episode. because we're seeing no signs of this being fixed anytime soon. Though, as I said last episode again, the Russians are reaching some positions that are likely more heavily fortified than they have been up until now. Hopefully that changes things, as well as the fact that there has been more mobilization happening in Ukraine. There are multiple battalions who have been in the process of being recruited for and outfitted that will be deployed by the end of this month. And it's thought that when they are deployed in a couple of weeks, perhaps by the late part of August, that could slow down the Russian advance in this section. There is one more front that we discuss sometimes, though the information for it is always very scant, and that's the African front, and how Ukrainian special forces has been very disruptive of Wagner activities in Russia. Ever since the decline of Wagner and its withdrawal from the Ukrainian battlefield, they have largely been operating as mercenaries in Africa, supporting various pro-Russian governments and forces there. This is something that deserves its own episode in general. I have a few people in mind for maybe an interview. I don't know. But we're going to look specifically at Mali right now, where an event took place known as the Battle of Tinjouatin. And I'm most likely pronounce that terribly because it is a Berber word and I do not speak Berber. So the background of what's happening in Mali is that, well, the country for many years has been in a state of civil war, where the northern part of the country has been in either open rebellion or semi-rebellion or some kind of hybrid rebellion against the central government and located in the south, to where now the northern part of the country, which is much more composed of the Sahara Desert, is something of a patchwork of different factions, two of the most important being some Al-Qaeda aligned Islamists, and then also the so-called Azawad nationalists belonging to the Tuareg, a Berber group ethnicity, who in the past were declaring that region of the country independent, and have kind of gone back and forth over what their demands are. But we're not here to talk about the Mali situation in general, but just this battle. So a group of Malian soldiers, accompanied by a force of Wagner mercenaries, were en route to a town called Tinjouatin, which is located on the border with Algeria. They're there to clear out various rebel strongholds that are located in the region. The first thing that happened to them is they got ambushed by these Al-Qaeda aligned groups. And then as they're able to escape and traverse forward, but still quite heavily battered, they were again ambushed by the Azawad nationalists, the Tuaregs. And altogether, they seem to have lost at about 80 or so Wagner mercenaries and more members of the Malian army. So where does Ukraine come into play here other than the glee at seeing Wagner mercs being murked? And there seems to be some kind of connection to the Ukrainian intelligence services. Like I said, Ukrainian intelligence has been operating in multiple countries throughout Africa to counter whatever Wagner is doing there, most prominently in Sudan. And in this case, the Ukrainian military intelligence did claim that they provided the Azawads with information about the Wagner forces there that allowed them to hold this ambush that killed so many of them. So there is some Ukrainian involvement here, at least on the intelligence level. It does get more complicated after that, in that there are some pictures of what people are assuming to be Ukrainian special operatives embedded with the Azawads, but they're probably old pictures or some kind of disinformation of some kind. Some of them were fake, but there seems to be some disinformation going on right now on the part of the Ukrainians to make them look more involved than they actually are, although, like I said, still somewhat involved. The Tuaregs in the Azawad movement are, for their part, really playing up the Ukraine angle. They are flying some Ukrainian flags. They are vocaling their support for Ukraine on social media. And in response, a lot of Ukrainians have become big fans of the Tuareg people since then. Watching Tuareg music videos and stuff have been pretty popular on the Ukrainian side of Twitter. So who knows, maybe that's our alliance right there. Free Ukraine, free Azawad. Though the information about it, don't believe everything you hear. Looking back to Ukraine, and one thing that we have been looking for months, years at some point, is that we really want those F-16 fighter jets. We've been sharing so much news about how or what part of the process the F-16 deliveries were in. There had been rumors before that someone saw an F-16 somewhere or they were being located to Ukraine already. That all proved to just be rumor. And when we presented it on the show, we did present it as rumor rather than fact. And so a lot of people have gotten frustrated. Like, when are these F-16s coming? We need them for the war. And it seems as though they finally have arrived. There has been the first confirmed shipment of F-16s to Ukraine. One of them was confirmed as being spot over the skies of Lviv. The first shipment was delivered by the Netherlands. The next one that will follow shortly will be from Denmark. We've discussed in the past what they will do here, and what will probably be the case is that they can be used for interceptions of missiles for one thing, and the other is some kind of ground attack set back from the front line. One problem of the front line right now is that for both sides, there is so much anti-aircraft density that being able to use ground support aircraft has not been an option at all for Ukraine. And for Russia, it has been limited to parts of the front where they had a bit more control of the area. When the Russians have been able to more aggressively use their forward attack aircraft, that has been a sign that that part of the front line is in very bad shape. The Russians have been able to do that. But right now, I don't expect to see like a lot of dog fights. That doesn't seem to be what they'll be used for, especially because Ukraine is very cautious with their use when they come in. They've been a long time in coming, and you can't have them blow up immediately, because every time a Russian anti-aircraft position or anything is able to destroy an F-16, it will be all over the news. Like, why did you give Ukraine these jets only for Russia to blow them up will be the headline, and we need to avoid that. So they'll likely be conservative with their use. But they're here. They can start being used hopefully soon. It's just a matter of integrating them into the current Ukrainian military situation and planning. Meanwhile, in Lviv, though, we have a bit more of a bizarre story, which was the assassination of Ukrainian politician Iryan Farion on July 19th. Now, Irina is a bit of a controversial figure, to put it lightly. She is, on one hand, a very accomplished linguist. A lot of what I've heard about her from Ukrainians had to do with her accomplishments in the field of linguistics, of the study of the Ukrainian language, of the development of the Ukrainian language in the country as a political project. However, the flip side of that is she was also a bit of a problematic nationalist, in that she made a lot of enemies with, for example, she was very mad that a lot of the members of the Azov and Azov-related units still spoke Russian despite being Ukrainian nationalists. She saw that as an abhorrent behavior. She had a lot of negative things to say about Russian speakers in Ukraine more broadly. She was very disparaging of the people of Mariupol for speaking Russian, even though Ukraine was defending them. She blamed Russian speakers in Ukraine as bringing the war upon the country, Russia. The logic of that being that Russia came to, quote unquote, protect the Russian speakers. And although that is nonsense, she saw the fact that anyone speaks Russian in Ukraine as an invitation to Russia to attack the country. And overall, well, controversial. Controversial. But as controversial as she may be, she was still Ukrainian, so her assassination came as a massive shock to the country, and we were wondering who could have done it. There has always been the fear of Russia acting within Ukraine to carry out attacks, which for most of the war has been pretty scant. There have not been too many terror attacks. There have been very minimal behind Ukrainian lines attacks by Russia throughout the war, at least, as far as on the ground wet work goes. Not none, but less than you would think. One exception to this being during the initial siege of Kiev. A couple of days into that operation, the Russians actually activated sleeper cells that were located within Kiev, and there was a gunfight within the city, but they were quickly put down, and that seemed to be all the juice that Russia had in that regard, because it didn't happen again. They were all killed or captured in that first attack. But the fear of saboteurs, the fear of Russia agents has always been there, so a lot of people assume that this would have been it. And though I wouldn't rule out that it was a factor, it seems not to be the case. The person who actually did it wrote a manifesto that was quite frankly crazy. This manifesto, he referred to himself, I'm not going to use his name, as a quote-unquote autonomous revolutionary racist. He wrote a bunch of anti-Semitic stuff. I guess he thought that she worked for the Jews or something. Who knows? When this first happened, when everyone else was saying that this was likely a Russian agent, my thought was, well, everything I hear about this woman is a little bit odd. So my guess is going to be that whoever killed her likely was a extremely crazy person with extremely crazy ideas, and that appeared to be the case. Well, of course, there's still going to be further investigation. Was he recruited somehow? Even in the case of mass shooters, we can say that, they did it because they were crazy or whatever, but they could still have been influenced by something. Someone could have purposely or not purposely, or combination of the two, where they just put ideas out there hoping for a vulnerable person to pick up on them. That is how shootings work, as well as Americans, unfortunately, are frequently made aware of. So maybe he was still being worked by the Russians in order to push him to do this. But we don't know. This is all alleged. And like I said, though I was not a fan of this woman, a lot of people were not fans of this woman. Her being assassinated is still a very severe threat to the country, because who knows who else can be assassinated. And the last bits of more not breaking, I hate when the word is used, breaking, more recent news, I should say, is going to be our international segment, where we can talk about both Hungary and Georgia have had things take place that are concerning from a Ukrainian perspective. So first with Hungary, it seems like every other episode we're talking about something involving Hungary. Wherever I turn, it's always you doing something. But in this case, partially in response to Hungary really kind of screwing around on Ukraine, especially recently, and partially because of just Ukrainian national security concerns, a decision was recently made by Ukraine in order to end the supply of Lukoil through the Druzhba oil pipeline that passes through Ukraine. This may come as a surprise to some of you, but Russian oil still passes, or was passing, through Ukraine even throughout this war through the Druzhba pipeline. Europe, a lot of Europe, still imports Russian oil, including countries that are considered more anti-Russian, such as the Baltic states. So Hungary doing it is not much of a surprise, though the country's politics have been heavily bought out by Russian oil money. But yeah, so this Druzhba pipeline that runs through Ukraine throughout the war has been operating. Because if Ukraine turns it off, that would wreak some pretty big economic consequences on a lot of countries in Europe, including countries that Ukraine wants to have a positive relationship with, like Czechia, for example. The spice must flow. But recently, Ukraine turned that off, at least for exports by Lukoil companies specifically. This has caused Hungary to go bonkers. Hungary is very much reliant on this oil, and has been accusing Ukraine of launching economic warfare against the country, has been saying that Ukraine could not join the European Union under these conditions. Hungary has been saying that countries that give arms and other forms of support to Ukraine through EU programs would not receive the funding for it because they would block any rebates for it. And of course, all that layered on top of Hungary's other problems with Ukraine. That includes those that we talked about in our last news episode regarding language, cultural autonomy for Hungarians in Ukraine, that kind of thing. And with the added context of Orban seeing himself as the representative of Europe to Russia and very much abusing that self-appointed position. So expect more news in the future about Hungary doing stuff in response to this. And next, talking about Georgia, the Foreign Agents Bill that we've been talking about again and again. But to a recap, the Foreign Agents Bill is an attack on Georgian civil society by labeling anyone who receives outside funding for various NGO projects, labeling them as foreign agents and requiring them to have a lot of very onerous reporting requirements, as well as blacklisting them essentially in the Georgian media. This law has been very, very controversial in Georgia, to say the least. Elections will be held on October 26th, and the Georgian opposition is kind of banking on defeating the Georgia Dream government at the polls. And though who knows what will happen after that, including Russia claiming that they would step in to defend the Georgia Dream government, a only very slightly veiled threat to invade Georgia and install the Georgia Dream government like they wanted to do with Yanukovych, or Medvedchuk as the case may be, just invading all of their neighbors for this. But anyway, because of this Russian law, a lot of Georgia's partners in the West have threatened to cut off funding. The EU has not done so yet, but the United States has. The United States decided to pause $95 million in assistance to Georgia because they believe that this has dropped Georgia below required democratic norms, and the Georgian voters have to understand that what their government is doing right now is making them a vassal of Russia, a country that has invaded them in the past and is occupying their country and is very hostile, and their government is trying to absorb their country into Russia, and that's something that has to be fought against. And things are not normal. People have to understand that in Georgia, in this specific example in Georgia, but I'm definitely winking at the United States in this, these are not normal circumstances, and you have to vote your way out of them. And it is possible to do so, talking to everyone there. The other news out of Georgia, however, is that the Georgian government is accusing the Georgia Legion. The Georgia Legion is a group of Georgian volunteers who have been fighting in Ukraine since the early phases of the Donbass War, defending Ukraine for all these years. They have been one of the major sources of foreign volunteers in Ukraine before the development of the International Legion. Most foreigners who came to Ukraine who wanted to help the military in some form or another found their home in the Georgian Legion. But it's still primarily Georgians who came to Ukraine to help their friends in Ukraine against their common enemy of Russia. Heroes, in the opinions of myself and many others in the country. But according to the Georgian government, they are accusing the Georgian Legion of trying to overthrow the Georgian government, and is, at least at this phase, informally accusing them of treason. However, the Georgian Security Services, the State Security Service of Georgia, has not provided any proof of this whatsoever. They simply see the Georgian Legion as a focal point for the Georgian pro-Western opposition, see them as even a potential threat in case the Georgian government has to do a crackdown on the country. People associated with the Georgian Legion will likely be the ones standing in the way of that and are trying to preemptively take them down, at least on a reputational level, if not a legal one yet. Yes, no proof this is happening, except political convenience for the pro-Russian Georgian government. So that is our more recent news, but I have two topics here that I really need to talk about that had to be pushed back some. The first of these is talking about the situation of historical artifacts and archaeological sites in Crimea. Several weeks ago, some pictures were being passed around Ukrainian social media and Ukrainian regular media, stating that the Russian authorities in Sevastopol had completely destroyed an archaeological site at the what's called the Chersonosis location. Chersonosis was an ancient Greek colony in the area, and its ruins are still found near to Sevastopol. The implication for what seemed to have been the case was that the Russians had pretty much completely destroyed the site and built a theater on top of it. The update seems that is not fully the case. These ruins were not completely destroyed. Some of this site is still standing. However, the Russians did severely damage the site and extensively destroy large parts of it. So the crime did happen. The crime was bad, just not as bad as people were afraid of when the news first came out. Like I said, this was a Greek colony. Back in ancient times, the Greeks had built a number of colonies along the Black Sea coast of modern-day Ukraine in order to buy grain from the interior of the country. So if you're listening, you may be aware of Ukraine being called the breadbasket of Europe. That is the case now. That was the case back in the early Iron Age as well. And a lot of the food that was being eaten to supply the growing population of urban Greece in the classical era that had to be supported by outside food supplies. Those food supplies came from Egypt and Ukraine. And to get that grain from Ukraine to Greece, there were multiple Greek colonies in all throughout Crimea, on what is now the site of Odessa, which near Mykolaiv as well was the largest one for some periods of time. So this is all very important cultural heritage to the country, because in Ukraine, the first written records about Ukraine come from the Greeks, as the first written records of many places come from the Greeks, because that's how written history works in many cases. And so by attacking Ukraine's Greek heritage like this, they're attacking Ukraine's heritage overall. It's important to me. I do actually plan to write a kind of history 101 about Ukraine episode that's kind of third in line right now for my special topics episodes. But anyway, we'll talk about this more in depth then, but just know that there are a lot of Greek artifacts in Ukraine that Russia has been very, very abusive towards. We've seen this time and time again. A lot of the Greek archeological sites that Russia is occupying right now, they have stripped mined them of artifacts, of the museums. They cleared out museums in Kherson and other places in occupied Ukraine to send back to Russia, which is a war crime. So this is definitely a trend of Russia being abusive. In this case, as well as many other cases. Looking back to even before the full-scale Russian invasion, there was the issue of the Khan's Palace in Bakhchisarai. Bakhchisarai was the capital of the Crimean Tatar Khanate. Again, I'll save that for the history episode, but this is very important to the Crimean Tatar people. It was the capital of their polity in the early modern period, and the palace there was a very important historical site. The Russians decided to restore it. And by restore it, I mean they just poured concrete on stuff. Not best practices. Big topic, I'll skip by to some of it as well, but yeah, Russian occupying forces are destroying Ukraine's archaeological heritage. In this case, they did not destroy it as thoroughly as people thought, but still pretty badly. And the other kind of timeless, I think, topic here they had to push down from other episodes was there's this one study done by Meduza. Meduza being a Russian opposition media outlet that had to leave the country, is now located in Riga, Latvia. But they asked a very important question. What do Russians really think about the war? Big topic, very difficult to answer, and one that has a lot of political salience, because are Russians supporting the war? Are Russians just allowing the war to happen? Are they all a bunch of bloody-minded fascists? Are they all secretly opposing the war but can't say anything? And they had to answer this, because you can't just do surveys, because who would answer a survey accurately in Russia right now? You get a phone call from somebody asking if you support the Russian armed forces in their holy war against Ukraine and the evildoers in the West. Are you going to say no? Probably not, because that's probably, the KGB looking to arrest people. You don't be honeypotted into that by telling the truth. And Russians are experts in knowing when their political opinions have to match what is expected of them and what could happen to you if not. So they Meduza decided to do something a bit more in-depth, which was basically an anthropological study. They went out into the country throughout Russia and just kind of observed for weeks and months at a time in 3 separate Russian regions: Sverdlovsk Oblast, Republic of Buryatia, and Krasnodar Krai. These are all fairly poor regions of Russia, Buryatia especially being one that has supplied a lot of both volunteers and conscripts for the Russian army, a region of Siberia populated by the Buryat ethnic group, closely related to Mongols. And by just observing people being involved in the community, they're able to walk away with a few discoveries. And the first of these is that, to a large extent, visible elements of pro-war propaganda have declined over time in much of Russia. Whereas before there were Z propaganda on all the billboards and all the people putting St. George's ribbons along their fence posts, actively showing their support for the war, that has to a large extent disappeared. Tangible, visible signs that the country is at war at all are almost gone. In just these locations, obviously, there's probably more to be said about the rest of the country. There's probably more of a difference between Moscow and the regions and between wealthier places and less wealthy places, and lots of breakdowns you can have. But just within the form of this sociological study, the Russian people seem to be largely demobilized, at least in the political sense. This mobilization in the military sense still happens, of course, but in a political sense, they're not being asked as strongly to be actively supporting the war as they might have in the past. And I think that does mean something, in that the Russian people are not so actively supporting the war. And there are differences in support. There's active support and there's passive support. And the active support seems to be fading away. That doesn't mean that there's opposition to the war either. The number of people they found that would actually oppose the war are very low and tend to be thought of as social outcasts. A lot of the time, they are social outcasts that don't draw enough attention to themselves to warrant actual repressions by the government or anything like that, but they're the oddballs. So they're stuck between this weird phase of they're not supporting, but they're not actively supporting, I should say, but they're not also not opposing it. It's stuck in this weird, this is a thing that happens and we support the government and what the government's doing, so we support the war for that reason. There is some idea of the war, pro-war propaganda in people's minds, of course. They still spoke of Ukraine, NATO threat, and all the list of things you can name. People still believed, of course, but not so strongly that they readily offered it up at all times or anything like that. What they actually seemed to talk about was the financial effects of the war. They talked about when their military pensions were coming, if somebody died in the war, if the benefits that their family were owed actually went to their families. Similarly, if the signing bonuses were paid, the people in the military were sending their paychecks back to their families like they were supposed to. So this is all seen in very economic terms, which in some cases, especially with like Buryatia, I mentioned that a lot of the volunteers for the Russian military have come from Buryatia, and that's because it's a very poor country. It's a very poor part of the country, as are all the places they went to. And being in the military is a higher paycheck than many of these people will ever get the chance of seeing. So their parents, their siblings, their spouses are talking about their family members being at war. They are primarily concerned about the financial benefits that come from being a part of that war, more so than the ideological need to be at war. Which again is not being anti-war, is a form of economic activity, and they are supportive of that economic activity. So not anti-war. Just because you do not feel the fiery spirit of Russian imperialism deep in your soul does not mean you do not benefit from the war in other ways and want to keep that going. However, there is one source of propaganda that is very much built around all that Russian imperialism, which is the Russian Orthodox Church. In all of these places where the Z propaganda isn't on the billboards and cars and all that anymore, it's still coming from the church. It's still coming from the priest. If you go to church on Sunday, you'll hear something about blessing our soldiers in their holy war against the demonic Ukrainians in the demonic West and forcing us to do gay parades or whatever. The church is and has always been a major driver of the Russian ideology behind that war. And if you are attached to the church in some way, you are being hit with that propaganda time after time after time. So while everyone else might not be as passionate about supporting the war, the church babushkas are. So those are the results of this study by Medusa and their sociologists. In summary, very low active support for the war, but very high passive support for the war, supporting the war either as a form of economic activity or because the Russian Orthodox Church brainwashed you into believing it. I'll link it in the description. But the last thing I'll talk about here as a send-off, because this was a topic that some of you gave good feedback about in the past, a couple of weeks ago, well, probably like 2 months ago at this point. What is time? I talked about doing a little walkabout of Kiev and some of the things that I saw and did. And one of those was going to Oblansky Island, that had recently been renovated and made into a park. And during that time, I voiced some of my concerns about the development of that park and the funds that were used to do it. And right now, there's an update on that, which is that the Kiev Ecological and Cultural Center has sued the developers of Oblan Island because in developing this park, they destroyed a lot of threatened and possibly even endangered plant life. This was supposed to be a nature preserve of some kind that was entirely destroyed and uprooted. And so the environmentalists at the Kiev Ecological and Cultural Center are suing them for improperly destroying things by not doing proper surveys, by generally destroying the environment. This is something that would have had more power before the war, because of like during that episode, I even described the construction mafia and how a lot of the civil society actors who stood up against them are currently either at war or dead. So there's not as many people standing in their way. I think the developers will have the higher hand on this. They might face some fine or something, but the park is there. The nature has been destroyed. Can't put the genie back in that bottle. So hopefully there will at least be some consequences for it. So thank you for listening to this episode. It was a bit meandering between lots of different topics that did not have a great connective tissue to them. The Olympics are ongoing, so at some point in either the next episode or the one after, the Olympics are a long time, I'll talk about Ukraine at the Olympics, but there's not so much to talk about now other than my favorite Ukrainian Olympian, Daria Beludid, who had won bronze at the previous Olympics in Tokyo, was unfortunately eliminated and did not medal at this one. Very sad, but that is how sport goes, unfortunately. Well, I'll probably have more to say later on if more happens. But thank you for listening to this episode. If you'd like to know more about Ukraine, go to the link in our description for a list of resources. If you'd like to support us, the best thing to do is to tell your friends and family about us. Like us, support us, go click on the thumbs up buttons, the 5 stars, depending on how you're listening. Go to our YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram, as well as our Twitter. Again, links all in the description. Follow us there. I do need to actually post things to the Instagram. I do have photos, but anyway. If you'd like to financially support Ukraine Without Hype, you can go to patreon.com/Ukraine Without Hype and join our list of supporters. I do have some field reporting in the works right now, so, some support would be useful in that regard. No pressure. So thank you very much to Deborah Grazer, Randy McNerlin, voices in my head are from Big Pharma, David Shepard, Giorgio, Ivana Kukratskaya, Michael Drucker, Mike Perone, Anna Karen Person, Anonymous, Barbara, Dennis Napalm, Devi, Dimitri Litvin, Etienne Soleil, James Burke, Jan, Yanara, Jenny Louise, Kevin Alberton, Marguerite, Michael Wickman, PLM, Shieldwall, Silas Frank, T. Bart, Vivek, Aidan McDonald, Alex Trochwell, Anastasia, Captain Technical, Chris Bennington, Christopher Yee, Daniel Spring, David Wall, Demetrio, Dish Taco, Emily Bivona, Evelyn, Francois, Grace Krause, Had to Laugh, Jacob Poem, James Wise, Jared Bradley, Jerd, Julia Lindsay, Justin R., Kyle Johnson, Laura De Leon, Laurie Halila, Lemon Ken, Levy Grove, Marianne, Matt Miller, Melissa Kaselko, Anonymous, Noam Hart, RDK, Sanjay, Scott Burry, Scott Gendris, Scott Tokiuk, Stuart Akers, Subtle Knife, Thomas Sobiek, Ursula Zolenkoff, Veronica, Victoria Leontineva, and Wandering Lens. Thank you all very much for your support. And until next episode, Slava Ukraini!